Okay, well, thanks very much to all three of you for really interesting papers that I think very nicely picked up on lots of the themes that we've been discussing so far today about the processes and the procedures of disgust, but kind of bringing it into a maybe more firmly social, political, public realm. Not, of course, that hasn't really been kind of underlying theme all day. So what we'll do now, I think, is kind of maybe talk a little amongst ourselves, but we will be opening this up to the floor before not too long, so that those of you who have kind of questions related to this session, or even kind of drawing some bigger themes of the day, can contribute through questions, comments, thoughts. It struck me kind of, there was this really beautiful kind of thread running through these three papers that sort of set up Disgust both as something that kind of structures, constructs, maintains divisions, whether they're kind of social divisions, cultural, political divisions, but Disgust also as simultaneously as the means to counter those divisions. So we have this almost kind of double directionality of disgust, if you like. And I wondered whether any or all of you wanted to talk a little bit more about whether that kind of oppositional disgust is a similar procedure, an oppositional procedure at all, whether the idea is to kind of highlight disgust as a public discourse, and indeed a kind of discourse of authority, or to intervene in it, to undermine it. Exactly what kind of are the aims of that procedure?
In particular, at least with the work that we just saw, I think Disgust worked in perhaps as the opposite as you were talking about, as Disgust as bringing this community together, perhaps on both an administrative and governmental program, perhaps, but also as a way of resistance. So in Disgust we thrive, perhaps. I don't think that's what happened here. What I really like about the work is that fragmentation of the audience, is that making very explicit that as audience members, even perhaps in this particular constituency, for example, here, I'm sure we're all very different. And perhaps, although right now we're here brought together under this, desire to learn about all of these things, I bet you that within our specificities, we're quite, I'm the only brown person here, for example. Yes, two, sorry, but three, yes, there we go. Oh, that's better. That means I'm not looking well. What I'm trying to say is that I feel that at least also in the context of Colombia, it was important to drive a point home that we're not in it together yet, that we don't think together the same way yet, and that perhaps that there shouldn't be a normative way to think about it either. But perhaps in that multiplicity of reactions and of factions, something can be built, but not through a convivial community building of the artwork in particular, but again, on the opposite, by tearing it apart a little bit.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with that. So
yes.
If I didn't say that, then I meant to say that. What I use in my work is, or I start to use, is Jacques Rancière's notion of dissensus. So he's a French philosopher, and what he basically, funnily enough, what he basically says is that what we think we have is a democracy actually is a kind of illusion of democracy. It's not functioning as a democracy. And I think we can kind of see that actually in lots of different ways. For the incident in Britain with Russell Brand recently about there's no point voting, and because, there's a sense in which there's a detachment even between formal democratic processes and a sense that it makes any difference. But what Rancière says about that is that actually a real democracy isn't built on consensus, and that's the kind of problem that we imagine. That he says the consensus is the problem. And we can see that in terms of like neoliberal politics, that the left and the right kind of basically agree that we have to kind of go for this particular model of market economics. So there's a kind of consensus. And he says, actually, real democracy is about dissensus. and dissensus is about the interruption of the consensus. So actually, I mean, it's a better response to the question I had before about building alternatives, is that, and when I try to talk about the process of critique, it's a way that's like the artwork, it's the process of interruption that exposes the kind of big, the real, if you like, that's at the heart of it, which in this case is cocaine and in its multiple meanings, which, you know, exposes that. And then the discourses that then emerge around that allow a debate which is not one of consensus, but one of dissensus. And aesthetics for Rancière is central to that project of democracy, which is about the interruption of through events and aesthetic practices.
Yeah, I'd say in relation to some of the stuff that I've been thinking about, I don't know if this is necessarily a direct response to, but certainly about the kind of opposition to disgust or the kind of reappropriation or reuse of disgust as modes of resistance. I've been kind of trying to think about what next, and I was kind of, when I was writing the paper for this, I was like, I find it really strange how I'm just presenting this incredibly pessimistic paper in many ways, and I can't see the way out of it, or I can't see the kind of glimmer of kind of how does one resist this, like what happens. And I mean, in relation to the mosquito device and classical music in public as a means of policing social space to some degree, there's been some interesting reappropriations. So the mosquito device, the great example I can think of is that school children started using it as a ringtone in classes because teachers couldn't hear it. So it became like this secret mode of communication, which, you know, to me is quite appealing in many ways. The idea that you can have a language or you can have a mode of communication that particular figures of authority can't have access to, certainly taps into some of the kind of themes of contemporary neoliberalism, for sure. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the classical music, Dave told me that he's heard people like rapping along to the music. And it's kind of that thing of, you know, when you have this kind of policing of social space in this ways, in many ways it's very easy to be incredibly pessimistic about it because it just kind of foregrounds certain social tensions. You know, the way in which kind of young people were described by kind of the Metro company. I mean, it is quite funny when it's like, oh, well, if we played Oasis, we might get more youth. But the word youth has this kind of disgust with it, this kind of repulsion almost. The word takes with it. And I just find, you know, talking about the kind of association of the aesthetic and the political, kind of how those two things really are foregrounded.
I mean, one thing that struck me about your paper is all the youth I know have got earphones permanently on and they're doing this, you know. Anyway, so I kind of, it's almost, I could imagine if you, I don't know, filmed footage of people moving through those spaces that are being policed by classical music. A lot of young people are already passing through that space with their own sound system, their own sound bubble. So it's kind of almost affecting more the people
waiting there. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I think it's so explicitly aimed against a kind of congregation of people rather than kind of individuals. Although, actually, that said, the kind of listening to kind of personal music and kind of social activity, those two things aren't mutually exclusive. I see lots of people with one headphone in, which is a really interesting thing to me. So yeah, like, but that's kind of how I kind of figure it, is that it's very much aimed against the kind of loitering, collective loitering, and the kind of threat of a collective body. For me, is something interesting.
Which seems to be that moment where it's almost as if that kind of aesthetic of disgust is used, or the kind of rhetoric of disgust that you were talking about, Imogen, in you know, the Daily Mail and the Sunday Mirror, and that kind of formation of a sort of homogenous group of people, whether that be the youth or the scroungers or the homeless, as a kind of undifferentiated sort of almost sort of falsely constructed entity, which I guess comes back, Andrés, to what you were talking about, this idea of sort of the need to divide almost as a kind of method of contestation, rather than necessarily straight away to unify and to accept that kind of unified collective identity that maybe has been inscribed falsely and kind of deeply cynically.
I think it's in our contemporaneity, not only really in Colombia, but I think in everywhere. What we need to do is tear apart our bonds, really, so that we can really seriously revise them. I think whatever kind of artwork or any sort of aesthetic or political activation that leads at least to a serious reconsideration of the value system in which we operate today is more than valuable. And in that, there's another artist that I researched for my PhD uses the mosquito, but in the gallery, for the gallery opening, Santiago Sierra, to disencourage the loitering that we would do, basically, in an exhibition space. I think things like that become really more important, and that categorical denial of language and meanings of words and things and symbols as they are. I think that's really the power of this disgust, and in particular of how I see disgust and the uncanny operating in that contestation.
So is there a sense in which you think that, this kind of mode of disgust as a kind of political or protest or activist mode is about the kind of renegotiation of the subject, or maybe a sort of reclaiming of that individual subject in the face of?
I mean, in some of the cases I look at, it's so thinking particularly around migrants and asylum seekers and irregular migrants in Britain who might be in detention or not. They're kind of constituted as disgusting in the press, in policy, in the way that they're captured by the state, the way their services are privatised, etc. So there's a kind of set of operations that are material, they're not just symbolic and images, but they're material that constitute them as disgusting. So they're aware of that. If you talk to them, they know that. They've been they describe being constituted basically as waste, as less than human. And so what do you do if you're constituted as that? What you do, the resources that you have, you can't just like spring in from completely somewhere else. So what kind of charities or tend to do is try and create an alternative moral value, and they'll say, but they're real refugees, or they're real, to try and kind of activate an alternative discourse in public. But what I kind of would argue quite often works better as a form of political response is when those subjugated populations say, you have made us into waste, and they actually assume the abject as a kind of response. So they become almost the abject that they've been that we're told they are, as a kind of way of articulating the kind of violence of the relation. So that's how I kind of explore it in the book, is those moments when the abject assumed as a sort of political response or a aesthetic response.
And does that kind of, as a way of sort of highlighting the fact that the terms of that discourse are not a kind of given, that they're definitely sort of imposed?
Exactly. And you can really see that around the word chav in Britain. So that's like white trash, to translate it. That sort of stands as an acronym, stands for council housed and violent, that emerged in the 90s. Well, that is used by, students, people with more cultural capital than working class kids who haven't gone to university. It's used by newspaper commenters, by policymakers, politicians, as a kind of negative, stigmatising class term about young people from working class or disenfranchised backgrounds. And then what you get gradually, in particular in popular music, is a kind of reworking of those terms that doesn't, in the case of chav, claim it as a kind of positive term, but that acts it out almost as a kind of, in rap music and in thinking in particular of Plan B, who's a rapper, who kind of act out and kind of connect the violence of chav and stigma to things like the riots, and say the consequences of calling people these names is actually that they, act out violently and sort of rework it through popular music and rework the imagery, and then it becomes more and more difficult to use as a term.
And so one final question just before I open it up. I think you all at some point expressed some kind of varying level of optimism or pessimism in your papers, and subsequently after when you sat down. And I'm kind of intrigued to know, if there is this sort of whatever we're calling it, appropriation of disgust, or of that kind of, that kind of rhetoric, that kind of those terms of discourse. Do you see that as something that will change the discourse? Will it change the terms of discourse and the kind of way in which, I guess, the arena in which these debates are enacted? So you were talking about how, these kind of debates are affective, they're emotive debates rather than kind of based on facts and figures. Do you see that as something that will change? I know that's a kind of an unfair question, perhaps.
My answer would be it depends on the day. There's some days that the glass is really half empty, and there's days when the glass is half full. And it depends on the artwork also, because as I was saying, when I look at Santiago Sierra, who's another artist of my PhD, I get very pessimistic. But I agree with his pessimism, because I do think that sometimes we feel so overburdened that it is almost impossible to think outside of this very narrow, screwed up box that we all sort of live in. So for me, it really depends. That's, I think.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
We'll go back to my gut instinct tells me maybe.
Yeah, no, I can totally relate to that kind of, it depends on the day. Sort of my feelings on kind of a neoliberal, late capitalist politics is, what strikes me is how kind of the modes of operation with post-Fordism have kind of become so kind of nebulous and kind of ubiquitous, and that difficulty in resisting when it's very hard to grab on to what you are meant to resist when you have this kind of dispersal. So I don't know if that makes any sense. And these kind of things, the kind of policing of social space via sonic weapons, and the kind of the language in which that's sometimes expressed as the move towards a control kind of mode. It's sometimes very hard to see the way out, or if there is a way out. But I hope.
I mean, the most optimistic thing you can perhaps say is that what we're able to do now, and probably have only been able to do since the economic downturn, is describe kind of neoliberalism as a kind of terms of class struggle, as a kind of ideology that's not just for economics, but for social and political policies. And I think all of that language was kind of, taboo, and in itself had become disgusting. So to talk about class, to talk about inequality even though inequalities were deepening in real material terms and have been since the 70s, really, in most of the global north, it was almost those things were difficult to name because of the kind of language of aspiration and fairness and kind of consumer culture. So there's a way in which the fact we can describe it, to me, means that it's probably over.
Yes.
So I don't think you can really, and that's a classic kind of cultural studies thing, but I don't think you can map and describe something that's sort of systematic in that way, unless it's already ended. And that's why I kind of think I was trying to be optimistic about saying this. It's not that waiting for something to happen or where is it it is already things are happening, and these artistic practices and scholarly practices are part of the other things that are happening which aren't that.
But we're also very much part of it.
We are,
and that's, I don't think we should sort of forget that we are very much enmeshed and ingrained and produced by it.
Exactly.
And where your research goes in relation to that kind of system as well, you can talk about these kind of things, but what's that going towards? My university will then put it on their website and give themselves a nice pat on the back.
It's really great impact.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a moment to open it up on that less positive note to...
Just tried to end positively.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. It's a negative week.
So maybe we'll open it up to see if there are any questions that either relate directly to the conversations we've just been having and the three papers that we've heard during this session, or even kind of drawing out those bigger themes. There are microphones, as always, kind of. Sally?
Well, it's not a question, it's just really a comment on all of the papers that we've heard today that really demonstrate the importance and the power of art and the arts in this negotiation of hegemonic discourse and how to work towards change. And I think, especially thinking on points such as the question, what is the image of the left? Well, I don't quite know what the left is here in England now, and so how can it have an image anyway? Mm-hmm. So I think that the artists that we've, even within a conference focusing on one topic of politics of disgust, have shown a diversity and a kind of blurring of genres and a blurring of topics that really show how fluid art can be in changing boundaries and being used to change formal democracies to processes and social thinking and languages in which we all function. And one of the perhaps big resistances that artists have to deal with is museums, institutions, and as John mentioned at the Whitney, how disgust had been sanitised and sort of neutralised. So really, I think this conference today has just demonstrated how important the arts are in developing these resistant discourses as a basis for philosophical thinking in many aspects of our society.
And I think the fact that we're still, 40 years after some of those early ASCO pieces, still kind of using them as this point of departure and inspiration for such a kind of hugely varied set of discussions and practices points to that.
The cumulative effect of listening to people talk about blood and food and transformation and disgust has sent me right back to my Jesuit upbringing and the word transubstantiation. And I was just thinking, I wonder if the recent developments in affect and affect theory as a discipline is kind of contemporaneous with, or linked to anyway, a response to the kind of ditchings, what Terry Eagleton calls ditchings, the Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens kind of new atheism. And that is to say, is it a secular way of saying our bodies are more mysterious than certainly academia has wanted us to let in, that there's something kind of more at stake in a life of the mind than the mind?
I want to jump into that.
Do you want to do it?
Well, I could go on affect theory.
Yeah.
I've got a really cynical relationship about the turn to affect, which doesn't mean at all that I don't think thinking about affect and emotion and feeling isn't important. I think it is important, but I actually think there are lots of traditions of thinking about those things. I think the idea that there's been a turn to affect, I think once you start to track that turn, it's a very sinister and cynical turn away from the things I've just been talking about, to be able to talk about ideologies and track them, be able to talk about class, be able to talk about misogyny and racism and the kind of material effects of culture. So I kind of, I sound like an old woman saying those things in a way. It's not trendy, but I kind of, whenever there's a turn, whether it's postmodern or affective, I'm always suspicious and think, what's been turned away from? What's been turned away from in the turn to? Which doesn't at all mean I don't think some of the writing's interesting and important, but I'm suspicious about the name of the turn. And what I'm really pleased to see now in the work in affect and emotion is much more engagement with actually feminist traditions of thinking through the politics of feeling and emotion, and actually work that, like, you know, the market and marketing as a discipline, for example, is a discipline that's committed to marketing affects. We've just seen that in the music. That's what it is. So what we need is critical work on how political affects are mobilised in culture, and as well as the interesting interruptions that artists do when they play around with affectiveness. So, I mean, that's my kind of cynical take on the turn to affect.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you, and perhaps Claire Hemmings, if you're aware of her work, where she is very much kind of critical of this kind of isolation of affect as this shiny new thing. And it's kind of like, if you envisage it in that way, then what you end up doing is silencing, you know, in particular, a very long tradition of feminist thought and post-colonial thought and many other scholarly activities that tend to have a tendency to be sidelined anyway, in certain Dawkins, Hitchens discourses. Oh, how I wish they would read some post-colonial theory. You know, and you deny that legacy, you deny that much longer and much more complicated kind of points of connection. Also, I think what Claire Hemmings is really useful for, and what she talks about in a really useful way, which perhaps connects with your kind of cynical take on affect theory, is how there has been this kind of tendency to kind of celebrate affect as the way out, that affect will kind of, you know, kind of emancipate or have this kind of resistance to ideology and coding and so on and so forth. And so she's talking about Brian Masumi and Eve Sedgwick is who she tends to aim that at. But her point is, you know, things like racism are so bound up with affect. You know, the things that you were looking at, a kind of right-wing policy that kind of delineates migrant communities as disgusting or kind of repulsive on an affective level, and kind of looking at how affect is not just in the good politics but also the bad politics as well. I think that's a really important thing to recognise. And that kind of connects with what Dave was saying about how the political left often responds to these kind of appeals to affect via a kind of reasoned argument of, well, no, these numbers are incorrect, this is kind of hyperbole, this is incorrect, kind of recognising the kind of potential but also the kind of dangers of affect as well, I guess.
John, did you have an early hand up?
Although I'm afraid I may bring us to a negative affect by way of closure. I wanted to agree with Sally and Lucy in terms of the importance of the aesthetic, and I think in some ways that is where some aspect of affect can come into a discussion about political impact. I think the example with OSCO is there has been this work that over the course of 40 years has come to be appreciated and understood in very dynamic and powerful ways. And yet, when the OSCO members were in high school, the dropout rate was 50%. It's still 50%. When they were in high school, Mexican Americans were a small minority within Los Angeles. 75% of the kids in public school are Mexican descent or Latin American descent. The rate of access to the University of California has flatlined largely because of laws that prevent efforts to take race into account, because it is already being taken into account in terms of the preparation that kids get going into that. So with that, the sense is, where can we locate the sense of the significance of what is happening in art or with the aesthetic as a politics of disgust? And it kind of goes back to what Imogen was saying. about effective use of revolt. And my first sense was to think, well, it's the only thing I've heard today that was effective was about music, and that wasn't the good example, right? But it sure annoyed the hell out of me, and it disinclined, and when I'm in stores, it actually moves me out of stores. I don't like... So I'm wondering, effective may not be the right thing, and in some ways that does clash with the sense of the aesthetic as being outside of kind of pure instrumentality. But what else is there besides that? Because I think we are left with things that are essentially, they may not have had the effect of, say, stopping a war or doing any which thing, but they've become very meaningful in a more broadly social way. So I guess I'm asking for a little help out of this sense of negativeness, because I agree with what Sally and Lucy were saying about it, but at the same time, when you correlate it to what's happening in a material way, it's gotten worse, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But without those materials that we've gotten out with it from ASCO. Am I saying ASCO? How would you pronounce that correctly? Without those kind of those materials that are attempting in their particular located moments to articulate the states we're in, which we now inherit, and we can use them to rethink the state we're in. Without those materials at all, there would be, what would be the alternative imaginaries? So, it's sort of, I'd say there's only the aesthetic. That is the site of all struggle. So the question is, the aesthetic's about the materials to think with, to imagine with. So it's quite small. Art collective can still be reactivated to think with in a completely different location, 30 or 40 years later, and still be significant. It's both pessimistic and optimistic at the same time, in a way.
And I think that's where I agree with Rosero. I agree with what you said about finding the primal scene as the root. But she is, in a very poetic way, articulating the sense of incommensurability.
Yes. Yeah.
That I think you have to hold on to as part of a politics, because once it becomes a very one-dimensional articulation of a goal or social vision, it's as bad as the thing it's fighting against.
Yes, that's right. That's right, and that's the bit of Christian that's closest to the bataille, actually. Yeah.
So maybe time for just one last comment or question, gentleman in the mustard near the back. Have you had your hand up for ages? And then we can kind of carry on this discussion over beverages.
Yeah, it's in response to John's question, and also partly to Andrés's presentation, and particularly your reference to Grant Kester. And I want to try and make the case, without trying to sound like Grant Kester, for a utopia as something that... Stop laughing. Something that does a lot of the same work that exposure does, I think. So Utopia gets a bad rep. It's either totalitarian or it's this kind of bland space of everyone getting on and completely ignoring dissensus, for example. But actually, I think utopias in literature and in other representations have been much more complex than that and have often featured an awful lot of dissensus. And how you can work through dissensus and yet still have something constructive and something affirmative. So I get really annoyed with Grant Kester and Claire Bishop because they seem to pose this binary, but you either have a politics of negation and disruption and negativity, or you have a politics of let's all have a meal and everyone can chat and wonderful, we've made a wonderful community. And actually, Utopia works in both senses. It creates a positive alternative that simultaneously makes the real outside the utopia, or outside that moment or that space, ever more horrible, ever more real, and it exposes the limits even as it goes beyond them. And utopian literature at its most effective has that in the utopia as well. So it not only exposes kind of negative power relations in our present, but within the utopia, and shows how people in that struggle to overcome it. So perhaps that's a way we can think positively, but still keep track of the divisions that wreck our society.
I think that sounds great. If we could just always hold on to that notion of utopia as being as this double-sided thing, where what you're saying, that perhaps the utopianness of the utopian project is negotiation, not so much establishment of a thing or a rule or a way, then I would certainly agree with you. I would sign your petition.
But I mean, the point, I don't want to unpack too much utopia, dystopia, because it'll go on all night, but I mean, the point goes back to the beautiful paper about misogyny and Katie's paper. And you know, the pigtails, which is a kind of dystopian. I mean, it's to me, it's the writing of the novel or the making of the film that's in making of the utopia, the crafting of it. That is a form of doing. So whether that's having a dinner party in a street, you know, when the street is no longer a place where you can be because there's no sidewalks anymore because it's all freeways, or whether it's, you know, there are all little utopian moments as well. There's arts practices and the writing of the novel. So kind of the fiction and the kind of doing of fiction, I think, is really important part of this.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess what we're talking about there in many ways is a kind of prefigurative kind of politics with this, that kind of, I don't know, is kind of revealing the cracks maybe in capitalist realism. Is that what we're maybe saying art might be able to do? I mean, I'm not sure I should say this in front of a room full of artists, but I'm kind of, the jury's out for me on the kind of political power of art. That was my diplomatic response. I've kind of, you know, seen some of the stuff around relational aesthetic, and I want it to be, and I guess from my practice, I'm thinking more in relation to noise music, where there has been this kind of politics around transgression and shock, and this has been kind of connected to anything that goes. It's been connected to a kind of anti-capitalist or more general kind of anti-authoritarian politics, and there's this whole kind of, you know, alignment of noise with resistance and noise art and noise music with resistance, and there are so many kind of problems with that I won't kind of talk about here, but I really like the idea that art can have that kind of moment. And I think you're right. I think the emphasis on the process, so the kind of, it might not be the musical object that's created, but the kind of participation in music. I thought what you were saying about protests and the kind of singing of songs and the kind of participation in that can in itself have a political value.
I would say not just the events, though, not just the art as an event, not just, it's the restaging of it. So for me, you're restaging to us of that art event. And it's the afterlife of ideas beyond the events, their documentation and their restaging, their recuration, it's more than just the sort of fetishization of the event of interruption. It's the kind of what art can do is be reused as a kind of material for rethinking later. Even if the thing itself was a bit rubbish, you know. It can
I don't know if that's a good place to stop or not, but maybe it's a moment where we all need a drink, and we can kind of continue this in the afterlife of the conference event by kind of continuing these discussions over a drink. Just before we do, it falls to me, I think, on behalf of Isabel and myself and all at Nottingham Contemporary to thank our speakers for today. We had a hugely rich programme today, and there's yet more to come. Tomorrow we'll be reconvening at starting promptly at 11 o'clock, so a little bit of a lie-in, to continue this discussion and kind of come back both to the visual arts, but also to the kind of social realm to try and kind of continue these conversations tomorrow. But thanks also to those of you who came and attended for all or part of the day and contributed to the discussion. I do hope you'll join us again tomorrow, but for the moment, we'll adjourn. Thank you.